A forbidden moment that changed everything: secrets, lies, and the price of desire. What starts as an innocent attempt to fix a broken belt spirals into a web of forbidden emotions, blackmail, and shocking revelations. Luna thought she knew where the lines were drawn. But a fleeting moment with her nephew Samuel blurs them all. As unspoken feelings rise to the surface and a mysterious blackmailer threatens to expose everything, Luna is thrust into a storm of guilt, temptation, and betrayal. But the real twist comes when her husband, Logan, returns home earlier than expected, just in time to uncover their darkest secret. What will happen when forbidden desires collide with ruthless consequences? How far will Luna and Samuel go to protect their lives from falling apart? This is a story where every decision leads to another ripple in a sea of chaos. And nothing is what it seems. Prepare yourself for a tale of forbidden connections, chilling threats, and a climax that will leave you questioning everything. I was holding his belt in my hands when, without warning, his pants slipped, exposing far more than I was prepared to see. Time seemed to slow as the moment unfolded, an awkward, surreal tableau that neither of us knew how to escape. Luna froze, her breath hitching, while Samuel's hands scrambled in frantic urgency to pull his pants back up. His face turned a vivid shade of crimson, the embarrassment pouring off him in waves as he stammered, trying to piece together an apology. "Aunt Luna. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. It wasn't supposed to," he mumbled, his voice cracking under the weight of his humiliation. Luna's heart pounded as she whipped around, giving him the dignity of her turn back. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, a desperate attempt to mask her own flustered state. "Samuel, what on earth just happened?" "It's the buckle," he managed, still fumbling with the offending belt. "It's broken. I thought you could help me fix it." Her irritation ebbed as the absurdity of the situation began to sink in. Turning cautiously, she saw him standing there, clutching the belt with both hands as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the ground. His sheepish expression, half embarrassment, half a silent plea for rescue, softened her resolve. She sighed, motioning for him to step closer. "Let me see," she said, her voice quieter now, though no less steady. Samuel hesitated, shuffling forward reluctantly. He avoided her gaze, his awkwardness palpable. As Luna examined the belt, she focused on the task at hand, willing herself to ignore the electric tension that seemed to settle between them. Her fingers brushed against his momentarily, and the unexpected contact sent a jolt through both of them. She worked quickly, her movements efficient yet slightly hurried, as if to outrun the strange unease growing between them. "There," she said finally, handing the belt back to him. "It should hold for now." Samuel nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Thanks," he muttered. But as he turned to leave, he paused at the door, his hand lingering on the frame. "Aunt Luna?" Her breath caught. "Yes?" she asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then shook his head. "Never mind," he said softly before slipping out of the room. The door clicked shut, but the moment lingered, heavy and unresolved. Luna leaned against the dresser, her pulse racing as her mind replayed the scene. The look on his face, the way his voice had wavered, it all clung to her like an echo she couldn't shake. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of awkwardness that would soon be forgotten. But deep down, She knew better. Later that evening, the house had settled into its usual quiet. Luna busied herself with tidying her room, hoping the routine would steady her thoughts. Yet no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept circling back to Samuel, the tension in his voice, the unspoken weight in his gaze. She couldn't ignore the subtle shift in their dynamic, nor the questions it left swirling in its wake. Then came the knock, louder this time. Deliberate. She hesitated before crossing the room to answer it, half expecting Samuel to be on the other side. Sure enough, there he was. His towering frame hunched slightly as if trying to make himself smaller. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he looked more like a lost boy than the confident young man she thought she knew. "Samuel," she said, her tone cautious. "Is everything okay?" He trailed off, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for the right words. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I didn't mean to make things weird." Luna crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You didn't make things weird," she replied. "It was just unexpected. That's all." Samuel let out a nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. Unexpected. That's one way to put it." A heavy silence fell between them, so thick it seemed to amplify the sound of their breathing. Luna felt the weight of his gaze, the intensity in his eyes stirring something within her that she couldn't quite name, or didn't want to. "You're a good kid, Samuel," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Don't overthink it." He stepped closer, his expression shifting into something more serious. "I'm not a kid, Aunt Luna," he said, his voice low and deliberate. The words hung in the air, charged and fragile. Luna's breath hitched, her mind scrambling for a response that wouldn't betray the confusion she felt. But before she could speak, Samuel took a step back, the moment slipping through their fingers like sand. "Good night," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Luna standing in the doorway, her heart pounding against her ribs. As she closed the door, she leaned her forehead against it, struggling to steady her breathing. She couldn't deny it anymore, the tension, the unspoken connection that had flared between them. It was wrong, forbidden, and yet it had a hold on her she couldn't shake. She shook her head, as if the act could dispel the thoughts swirling in her mind. But even as she tried to convince herself it was nothing, a small, insistent voice whispered the truth she wasn't ready to face. This wasn't over. The next morning, Luna struggled to shake off the unsettling thoughts that had plagued her the night before. She tried to bury herself in chores, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean and rearranging items that hardly needed attention. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, Samuel's words echoed persistently in her mind, "I'm not a kid." They hung in the air like a haunting refrain, their weight pressing down on her chest with an unrelenting grip. Standing in the kitchen, Luna busied herself with preparing lunch, the rhythmic sound of chopping vegetables offering a momentary distraction. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed almost intrusive, illuminating the storm of emotions she wished to keep hidden. But just as she felt the smallest semblance of calm, the sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The atmosphere shifted, the air thickening with a tension she couldn't ignore. She could feel him there, his presence as palpable as if he'd spoken. "Need help with anything?" Samuel's voice broke the silence, casual on the surface, but beneath it lay something unspoken, an undercurrent of emotion Luna couldn't quite name. Forcing a smile, she glanced over her shoulder. "I'm fine. But thanks for asking," she replied, her tone betraying none of the turmoil that roiled within her. Samuel leaned against the counter. His posture relaxed but his gaze anything but. His eyes burned with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease down her spine. "You've been avoiding me," he said abruptly. His bluntness cutting through the fragile normalcy Luna had been clinging to. Her hand faltered, the knife slipping against the cutting board. "I'm not avoiding you," she answered too quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "I've just been busy." "Busy avoiding me?" Samuel countered, a smirk tugging at his lips. His tone was teasing, but his eyes held a seriousness that unnerved her. Luna sighed, setting down the knife and turning to face him fully. There was no point in pretending anymore. "Samuel. About last night." "You don't have to say it," he interrupted, stepping closer. His movement was slow, deliberate, as if he was testing the fragile boundaries between them. "I get it. It was awkward. And yeah, I probably made it worse. But..." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "It wasn't just awkward. Was it?" Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She opened her mouth to respond, but her voice came out as a whisper. "Samuel. Don't." "Don't what?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. "Say what we're both thinking. Pretend nothing happened." "I can't do that, Luna." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she felt the room spinning. "This is wrong," she finally managed, her words barely audible but laden with meaning. "Yeah, I know," Samuel admitted, his voice carrying a hint of defeat. "But that doesn't change how I feel." Luna took a step back, gripping the counter for support as if the solid surface could ground her. "This has to stop," she said firmly, though her trembling hands betrayed her resolve. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, it has to stop." For a long moment, Samuel didn't respond. His jaw tightened, his expression a mixture of frustration and hurt. Luna braced herself for an argument, for him to push back against the boundaries she was trying so desperately to set. But instead, he nodded. "Okay," he said softly, the single word carrying a weight that made her chest ache. "If that's what you want." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Luna standing there in the heavy silence of the kitchen. She told herself she'd done the right thing, that she'd taken the necessary step to preserve the fragile balance of their lives. But as she watched him disappear around the corner, her chest tightened with a painful sense of loss. Why did doing the right thing feel so wrong? The days that followed were agonizing. The tension in the house was suffocating, an invisible force that seemed to press against both of them. Luna and Samuel barely exchanged words, their conversations reduced to strained pleasantries. Each avoided the other's gaze as if the mere act of making eye contact might set off an explosion they couldn't contain. Luna tried to convince herself that time would smooth over the jagged edges of what had transpired, that the unspoken emotions would fade into the background like a half-remembered dream. But deep down, she knew better. Some feelings couldn't be ignored, and some truths refused to stay buried. What happens when the heart demands what the mind forbids? Don't miss the next chapter of this unraveling tale. Like, share, and subscribe to stay on this journey as the tension builds and secrets unravel. Late one evening, as the house settled into a profound and heavy silence, Luna sat alone in the living room with a glass of wine cradled in her hands. The dim glow from a single table lamp cast elongated shadows on the walls, while the soft hum of the television played in the background. An empty attempt at filling the void in the room. Yet, nothing could quiet the restlessness in her mind. Each sip of wine seemed to pull her deeper into her thoughts, tangled and unrelenting. She startled when a quiet knock echoed from the doorframe, breaking the fragile stillness. Her gaze snapped up, her heart skipping a beat as Samuel appeared, standing hesitantly in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his face a mask of unreadable emotions. But his eyes held an intensity that made Luna's stomach twist. "Can I come in?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a weight that hinted this was no casual visit. Luna hesitated, her grip tightening on the wine glass. Her instincts screamed at her to guard herself, to create distance. Yet something about his presence disarmed her. She set the glass down and nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." Samuel stepped inside, each movement deliberate, as though he were walking a fragile line. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his gaze never leaving hers. It wasn't just a look, it was the kind of eye contact that stripped away pretenses, leaving her feeling exposed, as if he could see every thought she tried to bury. "I need to say something," he began, his voice steady yet quiet, like a storm brewing beneath the surface. Luna stiffened, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch. "Samuel, we don't need to." "No," he interrupted firmly, shaking his head. "We do. Because I can't keep pretending this isn't happening." Her breath caught, her chest tightening as the words hung between them. "What isn't happening?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "This," he said, gesturing between them. His voice softened, but his conviction only grew stronger. "You feel it too, don't you?" Luna looked away, her throat constricting with emotions she refused to name. "Samuel, you're imagining things. This isn't." "Stop," he cut her off, his tone sharper now, insistent. "Stop lying to yourself. It's not just me. I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. I feel it every time we're in the same room." Her pulse quickened, and she stood abruptly, as though physical movement could somehow shield her from the truth of his words. "Samuel, stop. You're crossing a line," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Maybe I am," he admitted, rising slowly to his feet. His posture was calm, but his eyes blazed with determination. "But some lines are meant to be crossed." The air between them grew heavy, charged with tension so palpable it was almost suffocating. Luna turned away, pacing the room in a futile attempt to escape the gravity of his presence. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking under the weight of her emotions. "This isn't right. It's dangerous. And yet, here we are," he replied, his words soft yet unyielding. "No matter how much you try to deny it, you feel it too." She stopped in her tracks, her back to him as tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She hated how true his words felt, how easily he unraveled the walls she had built to protect herself. "This can't happen," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Samuel took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. "Because I will. Luna. If that's what you want. I'll walk out right now. And I won't look back. But if you don't want that, if you're tired of running from this, then say so. Luna swallowed hard, her heart pounding as his words echoed in her mind. The logical part of her screamed for her to tell him to go, to end this moment before it could spiral further. But she couldn't bring herself to say it. Samuel took another step forward, his hand reaching out, stopping just short of touching hers. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "But I need you to know something. I see you, Luna. Not the version of you everyone else sees, but the woman underneath it all, the one who's lonely, who feels invisible. I see you. And I care." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she stood frozen, unable to look away from him. His words felt like they had stripped her bare, exposing the raw truth she had tried so hard to ignore. She began. But the words faltered, lost in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Samuel moved closer still, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. The touch was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it sent a jolt through her body, grounding her even as it unraveled her composure. "I'm not asking for forever," he said, his voice steady yet tender. "Just this moment. Just the truth." The room seemed to shrink around them, the rest of the world fading into irrelevance. Luna closed her eyes, her mind screaming for clarity that refused to come. When she finally opened them, Samuel's gaze was still locked on hers, unwavering, patient, waiting. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had been running from. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, wrapping around Luna like an invisible shroud, filling the room with an almost unbearable tension. Her pulse thundered in her ears, each beat a sharp reminder of the storm brewing within her. 1,000 emotions, fear, longing, doubt, collided violently in her chest, leaving her breathless. She took a shaky step back, her movements jerky and uncertain, like a marionette cut loose from its strings. Her voice wavered as she spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Samuel, I can't." The words felt foreign on her tongue, a betrayal of the war raging inside her. Even as she said them, a part of her, a small, insistent fragment buried deep within, didn't want him to stop. That part terrified her the most. Samuel stood motionless for a moment, his face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing of the turmoil that must have been coursing through him. "I understand," he said quietly, his tone measured, almost too controlled. But beneath the surface of his words was something more, a flicker of defiance, a faint crack in his resolve. He turned, each step to the door weighted with unspoken finality. But just as his hand brushed the handle, he hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder. "This isn't over, Luna," he said, his voice soft yet resolute, like the whisper of a storm on the horizon. "Not unless you want it to be." And then he was gone, leaving Luna standing alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of his parting words pressing down on her. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint, methodical ticking of the clock on the wall. She stood there, frozen in place, as if rooted to the floor by the gravity of what had just transpired. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank into the armchair, burying her face in her trembling hands. She tried to steady her breathing, but the effort was futile. The memory of Samuel's voice, his presence, lingered like a phantom in the room. His words echoed in her mind, relentless and unyielding. And his touch, though brief and fleeting, still burned like a brand on her skin. Why couldn't she shake this feeling? Why did he have this power over her? A power she had never given freely yet couldn't seem to reclaim. Her thoughts churned. An endless tide of guilt and yearning, colliding with the firm walls of logic and restraint she had spent years constructing. The knock at the door came softly, almost hesitant. It sent a shock through her, pulling her abruptly from her thoughts. Her pulse quickened, her body tensing as though preparing for battle. "Luna," came Samuel's voice from the other side. Low and uncertain. For a fleeting moment, she considered not answering, letting him think she wasn't there. But before she could decide, the door creaked open. And there he was. He held up his phone with a sheepish smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I forgot this," he said. But the unspoken truth was evident in his expression. He hadn't come back for a phone. Luna stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice firm but lacking conviction. "I know," he admitted, stepping inside, his movements slow and deliberate. "But I couldn't leave things like that." She crossed her arms, more for protection than defiance. As he closed the distance between them, "Samuel, this has to stop. Whatever this is. It's not right." He stopped just short of her, his gaze piercing. "And yet, here we are," he said, his voice a mix of challenge and vulnerability. "Tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me this is all one-sided. And I'll walk away right now." Her lips parted, but no words came. The truth sat heavy on her chest, unspoken but undeniable. Samuel took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. When he reached out, his hand brushing her cheek, she flinched but didn't move away. "You've spent your whole life trying to be what everyone else expects you to be," he said, his voice low and intimate. "But what about what you want? Luna, don't you deserve to feel alive? To be happy?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. She looked away, shaking her head. "I don't know what I want anymore," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Then let yourself feel," he urged, his tone soft but insistent. "Stop thinking about what's right or wrong for just one moment. Let yourself feel." Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was as tentative as it was electrifying. It was a slow unraveling of restraint, a collision of longing and fear. Luna's mind screamed at her to stop, to push him away. But her body betrayed her. She kissed him back, the intensity of her response catching even herself off guard. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling in the charged air between them, Luna's voice came in a broken whisper. "This changes everything." Samuel nodded, his hand still cradling her face. "Only if you let it." She closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. There was no going back now, no erasing what had just happened. A million thoughts raced through her mind, but one rose above the rest, clear and undeniable. "Stay," she said finally, her voice barely audible but firm. Samuel's eyes searched hers for confirmation. And when he saw it, he nodded. His hand slipped down to take hers, their fingers intertwining as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As the night deepened, the room seemed to shrink around them, enclosing them in their shared reality. The choices they had made, and the ones still to come, hung heavy in the air. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, Luna felt something stir within her. Something she had thought long dead, hope. The morning sunlight seeped through the curtains in golden beams, stretching languidly across the room and illuminating the disarray of the previous night. Pillows were tossed haphazardly, and the faint scent of perfume lingered in the air, mingling with the sharper tang of regret. Luna lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, as her mind churned with a storm of emotions. Each thought was like a restless wave crashing against her resolve. Samuel had left hours ago, slipping out into the pre-dawn quiet. But the memory of their shared night lingered, clinging to her like an indelible stain. As she pushed herself up from the bed, a knot of guilt twisted in her chest. It was relentless, clawing at her like an unforgiving predator. Yet beneath the remorse, there was something else, a strange, unsettling exhilaration that sent a shiver down her spine. It was this duality that tormented her most. The impossibility of reconciling two emotions so starkly opposed. Every attempt to justify her actions only deepened her turmoil, pulling her further into the quicksand of her own choices. A sudden sound pierced her spiraling thoughts. The doorbell rang, its sharp chime slicing through the morning's fragile silence. Luna froze, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced at the clock on the bedside table. Her husband, Logan, wasn't due back for another 2 days. Her pulse quickened as she crept toward the door, each step weighted with apprehension. Peering through the peephole, her stomach dropped. Samuel stood on the other side, his expression tight with unease. His presence was a shock, a collision of worlds that should have remained separate. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to hiss, "What are you doing here?" Samuel didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. His movements hurried and tense. His face was pale, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to fear. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low but trembling. Luna's heart sank. The way he said it, the urgency in his tone, was enough to stir dread deep within her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "I think someone saw us." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What? How? Who?" "I don't know," Samuel admitted, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting shadows to come alive and accuse them. "But this morning, I got a text." He pulled his phone from his pocket and handed it to her. The message was brief but chilling. "I know what you did. Both of you. Pay me, or everyone else will know too." Luna's knees gave way, and she sank onto the couch, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "This can't be happening," she murmured, her voice trembling. "This can't be real." "It is," Samuel said sharply. "And we need to figure out what to do before this gets out." She stared at the phone, her thoughts racing. The implications were staggering. If word got out, her life, her marriage, her carefully constructed facade would crumble. Everything she had worked so hard to protect would be reduced to ashes. "Did they say how much?" she asked finally, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the tension. $10,000, Samuel replied, the weight of the sum hanging heavily in the air. Luna's eyes widened. 10,000? She shook her head, panic rising. "I don't have that kind of money lying around." "Neither do I," Samuel said, his tone bitter. But we have to figure something out. If Logan finds out. The mention of her husband's name sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over Luna. She shot up from the couch, pacing the room in frantic strides. "This is a nightmare," she said, her voice breaking. "A complete nightmare. We could go to the police," Samuel suggested. Though even as he said it, doubt clouded his features. "And tell them what?" Luna snapped, her desperation bubbling to the surface. That we, she couldn't even bring herself to say it, the words choking her before they could form. Samuel fell silent, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on both of them. The oppressive quiet was broken only by the sudden buzz of Luna's phone. She grabbed it instinctively, her hands trembling. Another text had arrived, "Don't make me wait." Her heart pounded as she read the words. The blackmailer's intent clear. They weren't going to give her time to think, to strategize, to find a way out. What do we do?" Samuel asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Luna looked at him, her mind spinning with possibilities, each one more implausible than the last. Finally, she whispered, "We pay them. We don't have a choice." Samuel nodded reluctantly. "But how?" "We don't have the money. We'll figure it out," Luna said. Though even as the words left her mouth, she didn't believe them. Every solution felt like a trap, every decision a step closer to ruin. As they sat in heavy silence, plotting their next move, Luna couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Her instincts were right. What neither of them knew was that Logan had returned home early. He stood in the hallway, the crack in the door offering him a front row seat to their confession. He had heard every word. The door creaked as Logan pushed it open, stepping into the room with a calmness that was far more menacing than rage. His eyes bore into Luna, then shifted to Samuel. "You two have a lot to explain," he said, his voice low and measured, but brimming with an icy fury. Samuel's face drained of color, and Luna's world crumbled in that instant. The facade was gone, the lies exposed, and the reckoning had arrived. What will Logan do now that the truth is out? Can Luna and Samuel salvage their lives? Or has the spiral of their secrets already sealed their fate? The clock is ticking, and the price of their betrayal may be higher than they ever imagined. Luna stood frozen, the weight of Logan's calm yet piercing words crashing over her like a tidal wave. She had always prided herself on control, on maintaining a picture-perfect life. But now, everything was unraveling. Samuel, pale and speechless, looked to Luna for guidance. But she had none to offer. "Explain yourselves," Logan demanded, his voice steady yet laced with an unmistakable edge of betrayal. Luna opened her mouth, but no words came. The truth, so raw and ugly, was impossible to confess. She had to make a choice, face the consequences of her actions or try to salvage what was left of her broken life. In a trembling voice, she began, "Logan, it's not what you think," but even as the words left her lips, she knew they rang hollow. As Luna struggled to regain footing in the crumbling foundation of her life, one thing was clear: the choices she had made would haunt her forever. Her future, her marriage, and even her sense of self now hung by a fragile thread. This story reminds us of the profound impact of our choices and the weight of temptation. No matter how strong emotions may feel in the moment, boundaries exist for a reason. They protect not only our relationships but also our sense of integrity. Betrayal. No matter how justified it may seem in fleeting moments, leaves scars that ripple far beyond what we can see. If you ever find yourself in a moment of emotional turmoil or temptation, take a step back. Seek guidance from a trusted friend or professional before making decisions that could alter your life forever. Remember, honesty, respect, and self-awareness are the cornerstones of every meaningful relationship. Thank you for following this emotional roller coaster of a story. If this tale has kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on more thought-provoking and gripping narratives like this one. See you in the next video.